This conference will now be recorded.
All right, hey everyone, this is Narayan, and we are going to do a WFPro Live deep dive on complex intake forms for marketing groups because it's a pretty hot topic. When you have, and Doug, this is the conversation that we were just having. I was explaining how, in my instance, I was in some meetings with some marketing groups recently, and they had been sending some forms over the fence to us for months, and they were sending a lot of forms to us to build. And we were building these forms, sort of operating under the assumption that they knew what kind of forms they needed. So they needed issue forms or project forms, but they weren't, uh, we were operating under the assumption that they knew where these forms were going to be attached along the way in the process. So where the issue forms were going to exist and where the project forms and maybe even task forms if needed. Well, it became evident to me as these, forms were being reviewed as we were looking at the design of these forms and trying to figure out how to plug them into the process so that they could effectively capture intake from their requesters. It occurred to me that the forms were not designed to facilitate sort of a complex configuration that was sustainable and that would give them the reporting on the back end that they needed. And so it was something that I actually was talking with Bill about recently, and it's an issue where if the underlying configuration in the environment isn't well thought out and well planned out up front, the reporting on the back end is going to be a nightmare. And what I'm trying to do, and so I hit the brakes on some design and on some delivery, because what I'm trying to do is prevent that from happening in my instance to my users. I don't want executives to come to them expecting the reporting out of Workfront that they need. And when the configuration doesn't give them what they need, I don't want them to then go to the next person in line to fix that problem, which would be us system administrators, because we can't fix that problem. And so I was, going through this exercise with them of sort of pulling back and saying, hey, look, we need to stop looking at all of the metadata and we need to focus on the process and focus on the needs versus the wants. So you guys have heard me preach a lot about wants versus needs, but we had that conversation and then it turned into another conversation. And so what's finally happening is they're finally wrapping their head around the fact that we have to keep things really simple, but we have to really think about the user experience very carefully up front before we get too far into the weeds and design and deliver something that is going to cause problems down the road. Because honestly, I said this to these guys on this call, and it was great. I was proud of it. In fact, I'm going to end my phone call here so that I'm only on one device at a time. But what happened was I told these guys, I said, we can't let you guys go down this path of delivering something that isn't designed sustainable, because what that will do is it will immediately create anxiety for Carlton and I. And we will always have that anxiety because we will just be waiting for the day when that request comes through where somebody says, we need that data, and we have to try to go through a real painful exercise of finding out why they can't get that data, and then go through the painful exercise of trying to fix it. So I level set with them, and they said, you're right. We need to get this right. We need to get it right now. We need to take our time. We need to focus on just what we need. And it was a beautiful moment, because now what we're doing and what I was about to share with you guys was a actual prototype of exactly what Bill, what you had just said a moment ago, which was you need to have a flexible enough design, and I believe, and I'm paraphrasing, but I believe you said you need to have a flexible enough design on the intake so that it's configurable, so that you're not breaking things as you adjust and as you refine. And as you started describing that and saying that that's really important, it was amazing timing, because what Carlton and I did yesterday and today was we actually demoed a prototype, and I'm going to show you guys what we did here. So I'll just kick off a new issue. And show you this admin test solution. So this combination request topic here is, and bear with me, it's going to have a lot of sort of noise and prototype stuff, but I think you guys will get the idea. So what I did is first, ignore this first form, because what I did for them first was I showed them the prototype of how we would lay out a multi-form intake experience for the requesters. And Bill, you had just described how you would have a general custom form at the top where you would have fields, that were generic and that needed to be fulfilled on every single request. And then in addition to those, there would be additional forms down below for the use case specific intake. And so what we then did is we said, okay, well, let's now go ahead and attach your generic form that we had started to develop, the huge one that I told you is way overdone. What we're going to end up doing is pulling some of the fields out of this form up here. But this COEs required is the field where they say, or the requester rather, would indicate what it is they want. So they need advertising and media, they need content, they need direct response, right? So that's good, because that indicates exactly what the expectation is here, is that these things will be completed. And then down below, of course, what we have is the additional forms where these fields would then be embedded instead of being up here in one master form. And so what we decided to do down here was to have a checkbox here that is something along the lines of, are you ready to fill out the direct response form? Because if you are, you can just check the box, but it's not mandatory, so you can ignore it. So what that allows the user to do is to still submit a direct response and indicate that they are, expecting that, but maybe they're not ready to fill it out. So then they don't have that data. So this allows them to set up, the request. But, of course, when they check that box, then you drop down and you now have mandatory fields that must be filled out. If you're ready to fill this out, then that's when you can start to set some expectations of a response. But what this model really did for us is it gave us the ability to capture a request, and I'll show you, one of my test requests I think I put in here yesterday. So we'll go look at the custom forms. Right, so we have the general form, and then we have the direct response and the direct mail. But the nice thing about this approach was, if you can imagine those checkboxes before where we had the COEs, if let's say the requester in that negotiation phase decides, well, I really didn't need direct response, or actually I needed something in addition to direct response, then they can come in and check that box and save it, and then they can attach the appropriate form and fill in the data. And this was a great exercise to go through with this group, because with about 8 people on a screen share, what we were able to do is really demonstrate a lot for them. I was able to demonstrate, how we can build these forms and how we can lay it out and add a lot of flexibility in the functionality. But I was also able to demonstrate how we could alleviate some of their concerns around so many mandatory fields, because they were already in just testing. They were already getting a lot of feedback about too many mandatory fields, and they were hitting roadblocks in their forms. And so this is going to helped us out with that significantly, because now they understand that this is a negotiation phase and everything in here is flexible until the negotiation is over and this has been considered an approved project. And at that point, I explained to them that one of the best things to do here is to go into sharing and change the access for the requester from contributor managed to view, so that they can no longer change the custom form. And then once it's locked, then they can convert that request to a project using a template. And I'll show you the template that I demonstrated to them, because this was also very helpful for them to understand the correlation.
Hey, Narayan.
Yeah, sure.
Can I just ask a couple of clarifying questions before you convert it?
I will. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I'm interested to understand why you went with presenting a list of optional add them as you need them forms, and what that, how was that received by the people who need to train people on what each of those forms mean? Are they familiar enough and self-guided enough that that's working well? In contrast with trying to use form logic, where you might have various questions that then reveal a bunch of forms that were pre-attached to the request. Do you understand
Right.
the religious argument I'm posing?
I do, and it boils down to keeping the configuration, the underlying configuration, stable. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to the form that was unfolding initially, it was quite large and quite lengthy, and a lot of the display logic that was popping in to here was creating a lot more display logic, and it was just such a large form with so many fields already.
They started that way with form logic,
right?
But it was getting complicated.
Right, it's getting complicated, and so they asked the question that everyone asks: well, can that logic be set so that based on what you select here, can other things be displayed on other forms? And of course, the answer is no. At least it wasn't capability in the past. I'm pretty sure it still isn't. But and so we had to find a way to tease apart the details under the logic here and break it out so that it was not only logically broken apart from an intake perspective, but from a configuration perspective, it would be sustainable. So very much plug and play. So one of the things I talked with Carlton about today was we're going to move forward with a first use case, and we're going to let marketing pick the COE of choice. But when they choose one, we're going to develop the concept here and show them how there's a generic form at the top and then a specific form for that particular COE below. And we're going to show them how we would take that through the entire process. And once we do that once, maybe twice, then they will understand the pattern, and then they will understand how to plug in additional COEs as needed in the future. And in addition to that, it really lends itself well to change management in the future. So if the direct response team, which is a unique team who works their own way, and they tell this group what forms and what fields they want, if they come and say, well, we need to change our form, we have 12 new questions, and we want them added to our form, and we want some display logic in there on those 12 questions, fine. We will work with you all to develop a change to this form here, as well as the correlating project-based form, so that when you convert, everything is consistent. But the impact of that change it'd be so low to none, because on the system, right? Because that change is
contained,
sort of managed. It's contained, right?
And do you allow, as a convention, a single field to be used on any but one individual form, just to keep your 88 straight, or do you have certain fields that are common across multiple forms?
So typically, the common fields would exist right
on
here
the main form.
on this main form,
Yeah.
and every single form in the subform would be unique and would have its own prefix or suffix.
Okay, for naming conventions and trying to organize things.
Right, because if this group has a what do you need, and then this group has the same what do you need, but then this group says, well, I don't want it to say what do you need, I want it to say what do you want. Well, then I have to go ask these guys, are you okay with it saying what do you want? And they're going to say, why do you want it? Right.
Yep.
So,
and do you grant sharing to all forms to all people in case anybody needs whatever at any time, or do you also do sharing by groups so that it minimizes the number of selections for a particular user when they drop down that list of forms?
Great question, Doug. I swear I didn't send you these questions ahead of time. But what we
Dude,
actually
I have my
told...
feet in the lake. This is completely unprepared.
Perfect. Even better. So literally get your feet wet. So yeah, what we told marketing, what we told marketing, because they said, okay, well, can you share this form with just us 5 so we can test it? And I said, no, we're going to share it with marketing, and you guys just need to come back and tell us when there's a problem, and we need to stop sharing it with marketing as a whole, and we can pull back. But historically, what we've found is putting controls in place ahead of time and restrictions and boundaries. Overdoing that up front really restricts the ability for people to onboard, just like they said to us about mandatory fields. They told us that those mandatory fields were already causing problems, and these are marketing people, which, by the way, they told me have brains that work differently than the rest of us, and I challenged them on that, but that's another topic. But they're already balking at the use of work front, because it's a new technology, and they don't want to have problems, when they get into a new technology. And so taking that approach of the less restrictions, at least restrictions as possible, is the one that we're taking.
But it looks like you're using required fields still.
Absolutely, because there's a place and a time for required fields. And one of those places is on every request, they need to know the marketing project name, right? And the level of complexity and
right on your main form.
And
that makes sense. Some mandatory organizational workflow questions. How about on your, once you attach one of those other forms of interest, or do you recommend adding required fields at that point, or leave it up to each business group to decide?
I think leave it up to each business group to decide. But what we wanted to avoid here is, forcing so this was the first prototype, and this was the second. The first prototype was this was a mandatory field, and we were forcing everyone to say no to 9 subsequent forms. And then we realized, wait, no, we don't need to do that. All we need to do is just show a checkbox, and if they're ready to fill it out, then they check the box, and then the mandatory fields present, so as to sort of, force them to give some feedback, because ultimately in the negotiation phase, a traffic manager should be looking at this record and evaluating it for completeness. And that evaluation for completeness could actually be automated, because it could be a calculation that evaluates and looks for this, and if it sees this, then it would look for this, and if it sees this, then it knows it has all of this, because everything is mandatory. Minor
gotcha from a post in One this week. If somebody chooses a form revealing selection, or like a form logic section that then exposes something, and they fill some answers in, but then they change their mind and close that section, by default, the answers that were provided when it was exposed are stored in the database still. Have you run into that situation?
I have not run into that situation where it mattered, but what you just touched on, absolutely. You have to consider that as the admin. You have to consider the reality that could happen, and you have to account for it somehow, right? And I would imagine you would just have to get a little creative in
Your
how
calculated field
logic
could audit
calculation.
that. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, please do interrupt, and thank you. And for the other guys on the phone and gals, if you want to interrupt, by all means, please do.
Actually, one more. Do you synchronize the logic that you put behind the issue as far as form logic goes with the form on the project, or do you keep the latter dumber so that it just reports whatever was entered on the issue? Do you bother putting that additional form logic on the project level or the task level, depending on what people are converting to?
So I've actually been an admin for about 8 years or so, something like that. And so for about 8 years minus a day, I've been, allowing them to be out of sync. But it just occurred to me in a conversation yesterday with Carlton that bingo, the answer here is to have the issue form and the project form open at the same time when you're making a change for someone so that you keep them in sync always. If it's possible to do that, of course, you have to be careful not to mess up your existing data with one of those changes, but we always do our due diligence to make sure we don't do that. But yeah, I think that's the new approach going forward for me and this is a great sort of segue into that conversion to project, is to keep the forms in sync. Because there's really no reason not to that I can think of.
Just time.
Right, just time doing the work. But at the moment they become out of sync forms is the moment I get a little anxiety about when is that reporting question going to come later. And we're going to have to say, well, that's because the form changed, 4.5 years ago, and then it changed again 2 years ago.
And for your end user experience, especially people who are new to this idea, having them consistent is obviously going to seem more logical than anything. But even if there was a good reason for them to be out of sync, it would still seem weird.
Right. So we had a lot of fun with this experience, just sort of walking the team through the process, and, with just sort of a bare bones framework in place. And I love this approach. It's one that I think I'm going to use going forward, because actually I think it's one that can very easily be set up. And after it's set up, and as you talk people through it, you can just easily go in and rename these forms to whatever the solution is you're delivering for that group, and call your demo, call it your solution, right? And instead of going and doing that work again somewhere else, I mean, if you're already setting up the framework, then you might as well just turn it into the solution, unless you want to set up a demo, which is what I'm doing here to try to, demo for other people. But one of the fun things I got to talk through with the group was the negotiation and the idea that, communication should occur within the updates on this record, with the requester. But at that point of turning it into a project, I explained how, sharing should be changed so that custom form data can be sort of locked. But also I, had the opportunity to, talk them through how when you turn that request into a project, that's the perfect opportunity for the project owner to go right into the updates on that project and tag the requester in an update and say, hey, we've created a project for your request. All communication related to the project should probably occur over here on the project from this point going forward. So it was just a real, kind of fun experience, kind of talking that through with them.
Minor gotcha on that one. We helped a client do something similar where they wanted to raise issues, have them converted to requests, but in addition to just filling in the blanks, they also wanted to have a contact database so they could say which company, which person, which address does this pertain to. And also they had documents that would be provided at the issue level, and oftentimes conversations that would happen at the issue level while they sorted out which forms needed to be attached, who it needed to be routed to, and so forth. So we ended up actually building an Uber form, which is basically just a custom tab within Workfront that supported the selections of those addresses and contacts, the uploads of those documents, and I think they just used regular old updates in behind the scenes, the normal updates tab on the issue. And then on our Uber form, when they clicked a button, in addition to oh, and sorry, a drop down for which template to use to convert it. So similar to what you do under project actions there. But when they converted it, it also brought along the documents from the issue and all previous threaded conversations. So, and blocked the issue. So a little bit of automation in support of what you're saying. Like I've seen this pattern before, and we've actually built it out with a client. And so the benefit of that approach is it kept the person to whom it's being, who the primary contact and secondary contact and maybe the receiving contact and the finance contact. They've got like 4 different contacts, a ship to, a bill to, address, either or both are optional. And then the other slick part was to take the documents and the updates so that all the thread, the entire history, moves across to the project. Now, if you didn't preserve the issue, I don't know whether that would have then transferred, whether Workfront would have been smart enough to take those docs and the notes and move them to the converted project, which would have been, in hindsight, another way to do it. They wanted to preserve the issue, but as I say this aloud, maybe that would be another alternative. But the idea of, although I appreciate you saying, at that point you tell people, hey, go here to continue the conversation. You take away their rights, hopefully, so they can't do it in the wrong place. But I see that as a sticky point still that either might be able to be solved by killing the original issue, which some people do, or using something like we did with some additional automation that would transfer it. What are your thoughts on all the above?
So my thoughts on the transfer are that my understanding was that Workfront, when you converted an issue to a project, it did take the updates in that threaded format as well as the documents.
Let's do a test. So I might be wrong.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Sorry. What was your bet, Bill? You think it does?
I don't think it will.
Okay.
We don't think it will. Okay. And I that's what I'm recollecting, but let's test it because, I mean, you can keep them separate because there's obviously a custody transfer point where it was an issue. Here's what we talked about back then, or a request. Now it's a project. That's what we've talked about here since then. And with security, kind of keep those two separate, but a lot of people don't. And, we've heard lots of stories of people like, well, I went back into the original request and I changed some data and now the people are working on the wrong thing because I changed my mind, or didn't you see my comment? No, we don't look there. No, really, Bill? You've heard this?
Shoot, a project should be a one-way sync at one point in time with all custom data and documents pulling over. So
you're thinking it will come across?
I don't think it brings notes.
Dustin?
No, it'll do documents. It'll do custom forms. I don't think it does notes.
Not updates in the update stream. No.
Okay, I stand corrected then. Maybe it was just the updates we yoinked across.
Yeah, it's the updates as well.
Oh. Well, today I learned.
That's pretty cool.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so you can continue the conversation that you had started on the issue here,
So it's a copy of what was there at that point in time.
Right.
All right. Full marks to product from Doug Danhode. Mark the calendar.
Beautiful.
That's awesome.
Is it a copy? Is it a duplicate of that original note, or is that the same note?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would imagine it's a copy, but
It'd be a copy on the journal object on the project.
Right.
You should be able to tell by the create date of the note, because if it's a copy, it'll have to have a new create date.
Have to have a different quid.
That too. But if the project is now, no, you created a new project, right? So unless it's rolling up the comment from the issue that points to the resolved project, maybe, I don't know. I already got 2 wrong in this conversation. I'll maybe just let you test it.
Me too. No, I was just curious if that, let's say that was a directed update, would you have, and you have a notes report that shows you all your directed updates, would you see two of those now? Guys, there is something I wanted to raise today. I don't want to raise it now, but I want to make sure we save time towards the end. And that's an interesting challenge that's been given to me and Sky to execute in our instance today, totally unrelated to this.
What did you mean by directed update, Bill? And let's circle back to your other item
If you tag a
later.
user.
Yeah, tag
So
a user. Okay.
yeah, and so if we use a report that is filtered to say, show me all the updates in which I've been tagged, will I see that once or twice?
Oh, or twice. Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe to not to, I didn't mean to take us off kilter there. I think what you've shown is encouraging, Ryan. Why don't we pause that for some additional R&D another time? I'm certainly keen to learn what looks like it's now working even better than it was a couple of years ago when we built the workflow I mentioned. And why don't we get back to if you want to finish your thread of how this pattern is working so that we've got some time for Bill's thing, that would be fine by me.
Yeah, so the only thing I think I would just wrap it up by saying is, as I went to convert that request to a project, I don't know if you all noticed, but I stumbled a bit on a custom field that needed to be filled out, and it was a perfect example of how
Forms
the
are out of sync.
inconsistency between the two forms resulted in an unexpected error in the process. So
Well,
this
got it on
demo,
video. Perfect.
right? So we've got it on video, and so it was one of the better conversations I've had with any of the groups in my career, because it was just a really nice experience to walk so many people through sort of an end-to-end process, and to lay out the forms in a way that it made sense to them. And I even went as far as to pull up the issue form on my screen on the left side and sort of shrink it. And then on the right side, I showed the template with the project form. And just that visual layout of left to right, showing them that the issue form is over here, the project form is over there, and when the issue is converted to a project, unless you choose to delete the issue, the issue remains intact, and and that's the glue that ties your project back to the requester. So it just, presenting it in that way was really, a lot of light bulbs came on for them, and it will help them when they send things our way in the future, because now they understand what they need to send us and when they need to send it to us.
Yeah, you're teaching them the advantages of setting it up this way, teaching them how to fish, and you're demystifying it and using some really logical principles that I think most people would appreciate are repeatable and extensible and modifiable, which then reduces the need to get all the answers right out of the chute, because you can clearly modify it as you go. Who pulls the trigger on the conversion, and how do you prevent accidentally losing data if the template you choose doesn't have one-to-one lineups on the forms that were in the issue? Or is that your team?
Well, so the goal here is to make sure that we never have an accidental mismatch in the forms, so that that's not a problem. But as far as who turns it into a project, that's really up to the marketing group administration team to determine. We, as the core admin team, are here to advise and to guide them and help, coach them and push them in the right direction. But ultimately, they'll decide if that's a traffic manager who converts every project and and validates everything, or if that's something that they delegate out to the various PMs within these different COEs. What we're doing is showing them that Workfront is flexible enough to be configured to the point where we can delegate just about everything, shy of custom form development and system and some of the sysadmin functions. We can delegate just about everything to them, and empower them as much as possible, because ultimately at the end of the day, what we don't want to be at the core of our admin team is, on the hook for these unique configurations, because we're not the subject matter experts. We don't really know what the details in these forms mean. I mean, we know just
Right.
enough to get them in the right direction, and then we stop caring, and we just trust that they understand the nitty gritty. And if we see things that don't make sense, we'll point them out and get them in the right direction.
We've also just remember another client of ours. We've been working with marketing for probably 3 or 4 years now, actually. And they go one step further. They've got rules based on custom data that determine, I know what template you need for your project. You need the X8G/J15, which is all, they maintain all of those business rules of, depending on the answers you fill in custom data, here's the template, and then we've given them a solution that will effectively select the correct template for them. That, I think, is very specific to their, I think they do like 3D modeling and stuff for marketing, so it's a little bit, it's not just, images or glassies. So there's a bit more to it in that case, but it seems to work really well for them. I wonder how universal the desire to then automate at some point would be, or are you finding that with this solution, because it's so tightly coupled to their process that they know and love and are just trying to get done, they're happy enough just doing it and keeping it in sync manually and editing it manually when a new business rule or question comes in, because the lift to convert requests to projects is, simple enough? Is it? Do you have people asking for more automation, or is this kind of fit in the bill?
So I've had people ask for automation in issue to project conversions from the time I started, using work or adminning Workfront. But the reality is, I think that step is one that should always be manual, because if a project owner owns a project, but they can't take enough time to, and the logic, by all means, the logic can be there that says on screen, here's the template you need to use. But I think if the project manager can't take the time to turn that issue into a project and choose a template, maybe they don't even have enough time to turn those job roles in that project template into assignments, or, manage the project to begin with, right? So I've always fallen back on the rule of thumb of do it manual first, and when things are going great manually, then we can talk about automation. But we can't talk about automation if manual isn't even functioning nicely.
Yeah, I might, once this video is done, I might flip it to Glenn Coward over at Capability Source. They do a lot of automation around this area in particular, and I'd be very interested in, just some other perspectives on automation from folks who are bent that way. But I hear what you're saying. Once you have projects in front of you to manage, that's real work. And if all you're doing with the automation part is firing the fire hose faster at me, that might not actually help.
Right. So, and hey, while we were talking, it occurred to me there was one final benefit that I forgot to mention early to this multi-form layout, and that was something you may have noticed early on. So they also, at some point, they had indicated, well, hey, sometimes people, they're just always going to submit a direct response. They don't need to see all the other noise, right? It's always direct response every time. So I said, well, great. This combination allows for those combination requests, but if somebody's direct response, fine, we can still have the general form at the top and just show them the direct response form to keep things simple, right? So that it's, again, in the interest of not showing people too much and not showing them things they don't need to see, this really worked well for that. And this is the same form as the one that's used on the combination, right? So
sure,
changes are easy, right?
How do you announce?
Just an added benefit.
Yeah, how do you announce new entries into your topics? Do you do like weekly bulletin updates of here's a new queue and what it's for? Or do you just let people self-discover? Or do you use security so that, you know, only people would only see what they need to see? I think I missed your answer on that earlier.
So if you're talking about how do we announce the availability of these new paths that would become available,
Yes, yes.
that's something that the marketing group themselves would be responsible for.
Owns. So they announce it when they're ready.
Right. Right. So we deliver the technology, they announce it, they own all the documentation around it. In fact, one of the topics of discussion for another deep dive for another day would be some of the conversations we're having around using Workfront for publishing, just all kinds of publications and materials, training guides and documentation and links to other websites and resources, and
right.
So I'm already starting to develop some of those really robust dashboards in Workfront that provide all those links to all those resources. And so that's what I'm trying to educate them on the power of that, because I'm trying to teach them that, hey, if you get out of that mindset of we need to send out a blast email announcement to everybody, and instead you get in the mindset of we just drive everybody to that one dashboard in Workfront, because every announcement about what's new and what's up and coming is going to be there.
In context.
Right. That's where I'm trying to guide everybody I talk to these days, is build a dashboard and let's start publishing, document reports and user reports and issue reports right there.
Nice.
Well, great conversation today.
Nice model, Ryan. That's pretty good. I think, especially for people who are trying to find their way right now, hopefully this will be a valuable deep dive.
Agreed. I appreciate the time, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. So that'll end our WFPro live deep dive on, I guess we'll call it multi-form intake workflows in Workfront.
I don't know what that acronym is, but
multi-form intake in Workfront. I'll figure that one out later, and if it's appropriate, we'll make
a fun acronym. Okay,
all right,
thanks.
Go ahead and stop the recording, guys.